Welcome to our first Wednesday of the spring. And you can see, look, it's still kind of light out. So you know that spring is here and warm weather is just around the bend. Also, welcome to our first Wednesday in our newly renovated space. And thank you so much for coming. We're just thrilled with it. People have been so happy to be here for the week and a half we've been reopened again, and we're happy to have you here because we did all of this for you. This is your house, so we are really happy to have you join us here and celebrate. And actually, the architect is here tonight too. So, so Chip Greenberg is with us, and thank you so much. And speaking of thank yous, you know, we have so many people to thank for this wonderful, wonderful series. And the first is, of course, the Vermont Humanities Council. And the Humanities Council has asked me, please give a special pitch tonight to fill in your feedback forms because I know many of you are regulars here and you have great things to say about the series and the programs, so they're especially interested in hearing your reaction to tonight's program. So isn't that nice when somebody wants to hear your opinion? So we have the usual list of people to thank for these programs, and tonight we especially want to thank the Crosby-Gannett Fund of the Vermont Humanities, or the Vermont Community Foundation, and then our special library underwriters, the Brattleboro Camera Club, Brattleboro Savings and Loan, Downs Racklin Martin, PLLC, the Richards Group, and World Learning. So we're really, really grateful. But as you know, really the heroes of this series are the Friends of Brooks Memorial Library. And the Friends of the Library do so much for this library. This is just one thing. But without the Friends' support and without your friendship in the Friends, we wouldn't be able to have this program. So if you're interested in joining the Friends, we do have brochures right there. And I'm happy to make sure that one gets into your hands. So, by now, I think we're ready to start the program. So tonight's statewide underwriters are the Vermont Department of Libraries and the National Life Group Foundation. And tonight we have Erin Sassin with us, who completed her PhD in the Department of the History of Art and Architecture at Brown University in 2012, so pretty recently, where her research focused on the development of a building type serving single people in Germany from the 1860s to the 1930s, which is a fascinating topic in and of itself, I think, and its relationship to the surrounding community, as well as its function as a social and architectural model for later modernist experience. Erin is interested in the intersection and codependence of the worlds of fine art, design, and architecture in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, and housing reform and identity politics in architecture in particular. She teaches courses with subject matter as varied as the architecture and urbanism of Berlin, nationalism and identity in Central European architecture, the American home, methods and theories in architectural design, and architectural utopias from St. Augustine to the present. So, wow. So tonight we're going to hear about the family home, and I'm delighted to have you here, Erin.
Thank you. So this is a little bit of a different experience for me. I'm used to lecturing to maybe 40 students, sometimes 25, occasionally 50 or 60 students, or a bunch of academics at a conference. So a very new experience, but I'm excited to talk to you today. As was mentioned, I'm by training a Germanist. I work on a lot of architecture and urbanism, but I have a secondary interest in American architecture and American urbanism, particularly in the 19th century, and the ways in which what happens in the 19th century connects into the 20th and 21st century. So what I'm talking about today, of course, is the sort of changing notions, and I think some of the things that sort of stay the same when we look at the single-family home in the United States. And I think it's a really interesting sort of construct too, sort of forwards and backwards looking, progressive and sometimes reactionary. And what I want to talk about today are things that might be familiar to you. So you might have heard of, arts and crafts bungalows as sort of a way of simplifying, the American home, sort of drawing away from Victorian ideology. But also I wanted to introduce you to some figures you might not be so familiar with, like Katherine Beecher, sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who I think of as the 19th century version of Martha Stewart, and cooperative housekeeping experiments in the ways in which this might feel sort of what's old is new again, and that's what I'm hoping to get at. So without further ado, moving forward. In the middle of the 19th century, I would say, the separation of work and life is really positioned as the challenge of the day. And there's this feeling that Americans are sort of losing their identity and they need to sort of bulwark against industrialization, against urbanization. And you start to see the single family home set into the countryside first, and then into really early suburbs as very sort of new, I would say, sort of a new emphasis in American architecture. The country home is often seen, and the single-family home, as sort of restorative of energy and moral values. The city is seen as inappropriate for family life, an inappropriate setting. The country house, though, interestingly, is complementary of industrial society, not against it. The very things that enable this are sort of, balloon framing and new industrial technologies. And we'll talk about that later on. The formal attributes of these kinds of houses you start to see in the 19th century is that they're positioned as a kind of sort of being part of nature. And here you're seeing some treatises on landscape gardening and quote-unquote cottage residences from Downing in the middle of the 19th century, sort of major sort of player and theoretician. There you're seeing sort of Italianate villa, very sort of grand, and your little Gothic cottage back here, and another kind of Gothic cottage. He says it's in the English style, but he's thinking Gothic revival. Very much sort of this focus on, and this is sort of a contemporary's own home, again in an early suburb in New Jersey, that is this sort of Gothic revival thing. So it's sort of seen as part of nature. You have sort of a regular massing, relatively natural color palette embedded in the landscape. And you have a variety of historical vocabulary. So this idea that you can choose an Italianate home, you can choose a Gothic home, this says something about you as an individual. That's a sort of major key thing that sort of comes out of this. But I wanted to move away from these theoreticians and architects and think about the home as not only a physical ideal, but a social ideal. And so if you have the mid-19th century home as the guardian of a certain kind of sort of American values, the question is, of course, whose values are these? And who is the guardian of this kind of home? And here is your big clue. You have the Christian Protestant family with the woman sort of at the center, mothers in particular, who are being elevated up in status. And not to put too fine a point in it, you have this kind of really sort of, to us, I think, at least for me, a little bit nauseating poem, but nevertheless, this idea of sort of home as seclusion as an alternative to sort of the hurly-burly of sort of an urbanizing world. So the woman is positioned as an alternative to the greater world. The woman sort of in charge of this home is positioned as the alternative to the greater world and its temptations. And this is something we call the ideology of separate spheres. So women at home, men outside, sort of in the working world, and these worlds sort of meet in some places, but they're very much sort of seen as separate. Women are positioned as the alternative to the stern and authoritative father, with this sort of gentle persuasion of the docile mother. Think of like Mamie in Little Women, that's always sort of comes to mind for me. Nurturing affection and guilt replace control, fear, and punishment. And this is really key to sort of maintaining family bonds over sort of long distances in an industrializing society. Essentially, the housewife makes the home, and the home makes the nation. And women in the home are positioned as civilizing men. And I don't think it's accidental that you have, these little boys as well as little girls being read to and sort of trained for sort of a proper sort of upbringing and sort of morally righteous life by their mother. So you have this sort of interesting thing sort of happening where women are seen as more pious, sort of morally superior to men in the Victorian age in the middle of the 19th century, sort of innately suited to piety and religious behavior. They're seen as more pure somehow, sexually passionless, therefore naturally pure. They're seen as submissive, naturally passive creatures, sort of let things happen to them as opposed to being sort of actors on the world stage. And for our purposes, they're also seen as, I would say, domestic by sort of instinct. So home is perceived as the woman's sphere, her protection against evil, and the best setting for her quote-unquote natural talents. So the mother takes primary responsibility, and this is really key, for arranging and running the domestic sphere, and she does so with the help of advice manuals, which leads us to Kathryn Beecher. So Kathryn Beecher right there, there's Harriet Beecher, so they're remarkably similar, they're sisters, so it makes some sense. And you can think of her as the preeminent domestic reformer of the 19th century. Again, think of her as Martha Stewart about 150 years ago. Kathryn Beecher has this really sort of, I would say, particular pedigree. Her father Lyman is a Calvinist minister, her brother Henry Ward is a clergyman as well, and her sister Harriet Beecher Stowe, you guys may know, is the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, Kathryn Beecher never marries, unlike her sister, but she pursues an active teaching and writing career aimed at telling women that they should use their roles as wives and mothers to act as moral reformers in their own homes. And her most significant work, written with her sister, is The American Women's Home from 1868. And this is basically an advice manual aimed at helping women live up to the ideal of quote-unquote true womanhood by showing them how to plan a home to, quote, economize time, labor, and expense. And this is just one of many sort of lifestyle pattern books from the middle of the 19th century. And again, it has this very particular clientele, white, middle-class, Christian, married women. But as we'll see, while promoting the cult of true womanhood, which is something that's sort of taken as a given throughout society, Beecher proposes a home that's very different from your conventional Victorian home. So in some ways, she's really, sort of, I would say, reactionary and sort of towing the party line. In other ways, she's very much sort of forward-thinking, or at least wants to do away with some of the sort of building practices and sort of organization space that you see in your traditional Victorian home. And the interesting thing, I think, what we'll do is we'll talk about the ways in which your traditional Victorian home was sort of spaces delineated in it, how spaces are gendered, how these types of homes operate, and how much they focus on sort of status as opposed to actual functionality. You could think functionality might, that's a little bit of a, depends on sort of your observer. So what's interesting here is that these houses, and I think in ways that might feel familiar to us, but also feel very unfamiliar, are highly, the spaces are delineated in major sort of ways. Certain events only take place in certain rooms and only by certain people. And this is actually called room taxonomy. So rooms actually have specific names and very specific functions and are labeled as such. So of course you have library, you have a parlor, you have other sort of rooms, a hall sort of space, a kitchen, very, very divided spaces. You don't have the kind of living sort of room/kitchen that you get in a lot of homes today. You have a very clear public-private divide. The front of the house is going to be sort of course, the more public rooms. The back of the house is sort of the working end of the house. And I would say of the most public spaces in the house, you have the drawing room or parlor and the vestibule. And I'm going to show you an image of a typical, quote-unquote, typical Victorian parlor. This is essentially a place where you sort of represent your family and what they stand for to the world. The parlor can be seen as a way to express one's social status and someone's taste. Essentially, the house is a kind of museum. You can see this is incredibly cluttered with the woman of the home sort of as the curator of this space. And this well-curated interior indicates your taste and indicates your education. And I'd say we're not too far off from this. This just feels a little bit overdone and overwrought, I think. So the idea and the ability to be able to put together this very sort of pleasing To 19th century eyes, ensemble is something that again speaks to you as your talents as sort of a homemaker. Even women of modest means collected things like china. There's a kind of china mania in the 1870s and 1880s. They collected knickknacks. If you had more money, you would collect fine art and display it in a certain kind of way. And I would say the objects in a parlor too play a role in rituals of socializing and mourning. So take, for example, a clock in a parlor. These are imbued with a really sort of symbolic weight. They're banned from dining rooms, period, because you're not supposed to be looking at your cell phone or your watch or the clock on the wall. You're supposed to be conversing with people. And in the parlor, they're actually veiled with mirrors, veiled during times of mourning. So there's a way, again, sort of all the clocks should stop. You sort of covered these things up. So the parlor has something, and we'll talk about the ways in which Kathryn Beecher is like, this is not good. This is not the model, not the way forward for American womanhood. The other place I want to look at that's really sort of typical is the hall, sort of the entry hall right here, often with a staircase attached to it, which shouldn't be too unfamiliar to a lot of us. The hall or the vestibule also shows social status. And there's this idea who's made to wait in the hall, who then is ushered into the more private spaces of the home or into the best room, into the parlor, this kind of showpiece for the home. You also, of course, have the idea in a lot of larger homes of a front hall and a back hall. So the back hall would be for servants and sort of, everyday things. The front hall, of course, is for show, much more so. And if you want to think a little bit more about the role the hall played, you can look at something which we don't really have necessarily being produced today, the hall stand. And this one is from 1880. And every element of this particular piece of furniture, again, has a kind of moral weight. You typically would have a mirror. This one seems to be missing, or mirrors. And you would do this because, of course, it makes the space feel larger if you're dealing with a little hall, but also because you're supposed to check yourself as you're leaving or arriving. So propriety, making sure your bonnet's tied all nice and neat. You have spaces, of course, for hats and parasols or umbrellas. With parasols, you have the connotations of a lady needs a parasol. And with hats, I would say, and particularly umbrellas, there's our democratic connotations for men. So you're not riding in a carriage, you're actually just walking. There's something about that that feels very sort of middle class and democratic. You, of course, have seating that does not have any cushioning on it. So if you are some poor door-to-door salesman and you're made to wait in the hall and you're not ushered in the parlor, you better not get too comfortable because you're sitting on this really, really sort of not so cozy on the back side seat. You also typically have spaces where you could leave someone's calling cards. There's a ritual associated with women that had to be reciprocated. It's an indication of leisure, too. So you sort of leave a calling card, and then you pick it up and, of course, have to visit this person and give them your calling card, and so on and so forth. Often these would also be like marble surfaces. In this case, it's wood, I believe, which is an indication of luxury. Okay, so all of these things that in some ways are sort of for show, they have a lot to do with ritual and the way people live their lives at this time. Beyond the public-private divide, of course, and these markers of status, you also have a gender divide. So male spaces in the home in 19th century would be, I would say the preeminent male space is the dining room. The dining room is for drinking of port, and then of course you have the parlor or the drawing room. And this is also sort of comes from the term with drawing room. So after dinner, basically, women go into the space together. If anyone's watched Downton Abbey, everyone sort of goes to different places after they eat dinner. In Britain, but so you have, again, also the parlor functioning as a space where guests are received, particularly when the male of the house is not home. You cannot receive guests in your dining room if your husband is not around. That's totally not okay. You even have a sick and healthy space divide. So special rooms exist in larger homes like a sick room, not so much in this smaller cottage. But back to Katherine Beecher. How does Beecher propose to help the housewife economize time, labor, and expense? She thinks you can do this through the redesign of the home. And she says you need, above all, to eliminate this sort of formal parlor and these really sort of overstuffed interiors that we saw and we'll see again right there. She claims these elements provide an aesthetic of visual rather than actual comfort. So you can think of visual comfort as soft surfaces, rich textures, upholstered furniture, carpeted floors, tables with tablecloths, windows with curtains, patterned wallpaper, and to Beecher, these bespeak vanity, extravagance, and idleness. They bespeak waste, and actual not real comfort, but comfort really for show. And she says, you don't actually need this space, the parlor, and you also don't need the hall. And so she comes up with a sort of diagram of her own for a more well-functioning, well-appointed home that has still a drawing room, but you can think of this a little bit more like a family room as opposed to this formal space like the parlor. And it's not going to be overstuffed and cluttered with all these sort of knickknacks and soft surfaces. Above all, she says, you don't need that waste of space that is the hall. You essentially have a little vestibule that you come into, and immediately you go into these more multi-purpose rooms that she proposes. Make life less compartmentalized. They actually include family togetherness. You know, this idea that I think should feel familiar to us, that you don't go off into like a little separate ward of rooms. The family sort of who plays together, stays together. And you're seeing here, second floor, and of course the ground floor design. She also advocates for things like movable screens. So if you have a need to create sort of two rooms, you can do so temporarily with things that actually also serve as sort of built-in furniture. So storage, you don't need all that clutter, you get things out as you need it. This is something to keep in the back of your minds when we look at arts and crafts and craftsman homes in a little bit. She also advocates for rationalizing the kitchen. Everything has its place. Neat and tidy. And she makes it much more efficient because everything's sort of arranged in the ways that you actually would use it. And separating out, again, sort of messier spaces from maybe slightly cleaner. Well, it depends. If you're thinking about sort of coal-fired stoves as clean and kitchens as messy. And this is interesting because what she's doing is really well in advance of what's really popularized in the 19-teens and the 1920s and comes to the fore, particularly in the later 20s and the early 1930s. This idea that if you have a space that's ill-planned, you are actually going to waste all sorts of time going from point A to point B as preparing your food versus having things nice and neat in a nice little line right there that will make your whole life that much easier. So this is all, again, going to be picked up on by later people, though they won't credit Kathryn Beecher for it necessarily. It's pretty typical. Partly because she writes sort of domestic advice manuals and she's not an architect. So there's this sort of interesting thing that goes on. So here you're seeing your sort of typical home. So with Beecher, you have the idea of a well-positioned home in nature that reflects its owner's morals and priorities, that is not wasteful, that is sort of much more multi-use. And the question is, of course, why is this important for Beecher? Training women for the profession of housewife as men are trained for their professions and providing them with a proper setting that supports this important work is seen as very important or very significant for Beecher. It's a means to end drudgery, but it also, of course, ending this drudgery isn't simply because you feel bad for these ladies, but it's sort of, again, allowing them to devote more of their efforts to raising Christian children. And you can see, even in the plan, sort of the image you're seeing of this home, a cross on the exterior, actually a cruciform sort of plan to the home. There's all this sort of way in which visually encoded in these designs by Beecher and a lot of contemporaries of hers as well. There's sort of Christian imagery. And there's just another little detail. So pointed arches for doorways, sort of, again, have these ecclesiastical connotations. You could sort of hang, Christian imagery on the walls. It's really, really important for her. Pump organs, too, like having an organ or a piano in the home. You're sitting around singing hymns. But the bigger thing, of course, is that she positions that there are grave dangers if you don't follow what she's prescribing. If you end up with a poorly run house that exhibits false opulence, if you have that overstuffed parlor, the ultimate consequences, again, could be really dire, I should say, not dire. You could, one, drive your husband to the pub. Like, that's one thing. Like, he doesn't want to be at home. Your house isn't well run. It's sort of messy, or it's too cluttered, or it's too feminine, or something's going on. And you could also ruin family togetherness. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, again, Katherine Beecher's sister, writes an essay in 1869, so contemporaneous of this publication called The Ravages of a Carpet, which told of a sitting room that was a site of family togetherness until the purchase of an expensive Brussels carpet they were afraid to destroy, and so they stopped hanging out together because they're too worried someone's going to spill juice on the carpet. Anyway, so Kathryn Beecher, a pretty important figure in the 19th century, and I think has this sort of long shadow, but has largely been forgotten. But what I want to do is switch from Beecher, and we'll come back to her later on in the ways that, again, what's old is new again, and move to another model of reforming that home, again in the service of simplicity and a simple life and economy that's read as very sort of American, even though it has strangely British precedents, and that is the arts and crafts or craftsman bungalow. The bungalow, sort of very simple home, and I'll talk about the hallmarks of this and we'll look at some interiors as well, was part of a search for an American architecture and a reaction again against those sort of overstuffed Victorian homes with their warren of small rooms. And it's much about sort of the spaces that are being created as the sort of lifestyle that's being encouraged. By the turn of the 20th century, the Victorian home had become, at least for a subset of the American population, morally problematic and, again, unsuitable. This moralizing tone, the idea that design can inculcate proper behaviors, of course is existing with Beecher and all of these other reformers in the 19th century, but sort of picks up new power with the British arts and crafts movement. And here you have an interior or an advertisement for Morris and Company, which is sort of the preeminent arts and crafts company in Britain based in London, run by William Morris. So they have this sort of moralizing tone coming from Britain via the arts and crafts movement, which feels that meaningful and moral labor should not be tied to industry, but instead to handicraft. And the American arts and crafts movement shares the sort of English critique of industrial production, placing great emphasis on handicraft, or at least things that look handcrafted, but abandons much of the British movement's political implications, i.e. basically the aesthetic reform of the home often occurs without accompanying political and social reform. So Morris ends up joining the Socialist Party later on and moves away from actually doing interiors for wealthy people. The American arts and crafts movement is fueled, much like the contemporaneous colonial revival, by a kind of anti-modernism and a rejection also of, and we'll come back to this, the quote-unquote feminized practices of Victorian culture. But first, the origins of the bungalow. So people have said this kind of architecture comes from seaside resorts, it comes from 17th century Anglo-Indian homes, it comes from Japanese homes, and I think all of these sort of play a part. In general, if you look at the exterior of these homes, they tend to have sort of a low profile, a simple footprint, a use of sort of quote-unquote natural materials, often shingled, sometimes unpainted. Again, this idea of sort of colors being used that roughly approximate nature, not sort of a blazing like a blue painted sort of siding. You often have a relaxed, sort of an organic relationship to nature in sort of wraparound porches, or at least broad sort of porches. This blurring of sort of inside and outside space in some ways in which these homes actually sort of maximize ventilation. And I would say the bungalow in the 19th century, early 20th century is really appealing because it's seen as simple and democratic. It's available for all people, ostensibly, at a much lower price point. Also because, you can order these, as you can probably see from this label, from Sears, like as a kit home. And a lot of this is made possible by balloon framing. So this idea that you basically have like 2x4s fitted together, that's much sort of less expensive, requires much less skill than your traditional sort of post and beam home that would have existed before this particular point. For wealthier people who purchase much larger sort of craftsman-style arts and crafts homes, it makes a virtue of sort of simplicity and simple family life. You have the idea, and sort of I'd say the very compelling, maybe selling point of sort of taste, rusticity, Americanness, and economy all in one with your craftsman home. And again, you can get it for about, $1,400, which, in 1916 is actually a lot of money, but comparatively speaking, not crazy expensive. It's seen as sort of classless, and again, very, very democratic, and is often embellished with do-it-yourself arts and crafts sort of interiors, and this idea of quality being more important than necessarily quantity. And that sort of should feel familiar with Beecher. And I want to show you sort of, again, interiors. So your sort of craftsman bungalow interior living room versus your typical Victorian parlor. Similarly, your typical Victorian bedroom versus, I would say, a rather upscale arts and crafts bedroom. Marked by a kind of simplicity, I would say, in general, much sort of more flexible, much more open in the interior. I'm thinking, these are larger openings between doors than you would see in a Victorian home where everything sort of, again, goes to this sort of central hall and hallway. You can think of it as a little bit Beecher was proposing. Flexible room dividers, built-ins, relatively sort of simple furnishings, much more sort of pared down as far as how much clutter is actually in this interior, though I'm thinking of all these like little rugs everywhere and it looks a little bit sort of messy to clean. And one of the interesting things, of course, is that it changes the role of women in the home. Where your Victorian home had positioned the woman as sort of a curator, basically, who had a kind of superiority and validation because she had this important role to play in sort of collecting and organizing all of these things. With the arts and crafts bungalow, that's less important. You have much more of an emphasis on sort of sturdy, almost rude construction, rougher materials, greater links to the outside, an emphasis on the horizontal as opposed to the vertical. The horizontal is seen as a personification of sort of hospitality, I should say, and repose. These ceiling beams, projecting mantel shelves, horizontally placed windows, plate rails, sort of above wainscoting, which you actually don't see here. This sort of interesting idea, and I'm going to move forward and sort of skip over this. You also have the emergence of something called the ingle nook in a lot of arts and crafts style homes or craftsman style homes, which is almost like this little room within a room set around a fireplace. Again, the heart of the home, the idea of sort of family togetherness, and people would commonly have like didactic mottos hanging above the fireplace. Like, you can think of it as those like throw pillows you sometimes see, or my mom has, where it's like home is where the heart is, and it's needlepoint, and it's on your couch. You have the same sort of thing happening here, right above these sort of hearts. And I would say these are rather upscale interiors in general. But what's interesting is the hearth is sort of considered to be feminine and a feminine domain, but almost everything else has been masculinized. You don't actually have those rooms that are designated, this is the woman's sphere. All of a sudden it's all about the family, sort of togetherness in the family sphere, and with father sort of at the top. And I would say the biggest rub, of course, with your craftsman home is that it's a little bit like when you're asked, and I don't know how many of you have had the experience of this, saying like, I need to bring cupcakes to my kid's bake sale, and you feel like I need to make them from scratch, as opposed to just going to the store. You can think of the arts and crafts home as making them from scratch. It's not okay simply to buy curtains for this. You're supposed to embroider them. You're supposed to embellish them. You're supposed to do your own artwork. You're supposed to stencil your own walls. All of a sudden, sort of upping the ante. Albeit maybe taking out some of that clutter and making day-to-day cleaning easier, there's a kind of way in which you can't just buy your way into respectability anymore. You have to sort of show it with physical labor in these sort of artistic directions. So you have to, again, you could purchase art pottery, but for the most part, you can't just buy, consume, operate as a curator. Here. And I would say, of course, the major problem that remains in both of these models, the Victorian home, your craftsman home, and to some degree, I would say, Kathryn Beecher's home as well, is the idea that the kitchen and housekeeping writ large are still a huge problem. Despite very sort of modern labor-saving devices that you see right here. And I always ask students, particularly when they're living in a dorm, to sort of reflect on the fact that if they didn't have someone cleaning their dorm, if they didn't have someone cooking their meals, if they didn't have basically every need catered to, with the exception of taking their notes, sometimes that happens too, and going to class, how much time of your day would that actually eat up? And I think it's still a sort of question that you can ask of yourselves. What sort of housekeeping do you undertake each day, each week? How much time is involved? What are the component steps of this? What if there were few or no labor-saving devices, or your labor-saving device is basically something like this. What does this actually leave time for? And what would you have to give up if this sort of housekeeping was that much more demanding? And for 19th century women, I would say probably men too to some extent, this is really a pressing issue. You're stoking your coal stove. You're getting the pot to sort of boil. You're doing everything from scratch. And people, by the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, are starting to say, there's got to be a slightly better way. And they come up with this idea of housekeeping that can be done cooperatively. So the drudgery of the single kitchen and the isolation of the kitchen within the rural, suburban, or urban household is the problem, really, of the age, despite these labor-saving devices. And this is precisely the issues that proponents of cooperative housekeeping seek to combat. And you're looking at two major players here, Charlotte Perkins Gilman and Lucinia Fay Pierce. And there's Pierce's book, which I think you can actually read. It might be on Google Books through the Harvard libraries, if you're really curious. Okay. So the idea here is that you get rid of the separate kitchen and the individual cook, maid, laundress by banding together resources and people. And they say there are a lot of benefits to be gleaned from this. And here you're looking at a Ladies' Home Journal article on starting a community or cooperative kitchen. You have economic savings. If you buy in bulk, you're going to save on money. If you buy 10 pounds of potatoes as opposed to 1 pound of potatoes, you're going to get more potatoes, more bang for your buck. You have increased health and efficiency. You have this idea that maybe if you band together your resources, you can hire managers and skilled workers trained as opposed to being a jack of all trades and a master of none. You have the idea of ennobling sort of household work and workers by paying people wages as opposed to having this be waged work. You have decreased crime versus group surveillance, i.e. solving the servant problem. So the idea that the servant is putting things off in their pocket. And people say at the time it's really, really difficult to get a good servant. So this is solving a little bit of that problem. And then of course, you also have, and I would say this is the key thing, the freedom for some of these women to work outside the home or at least pursue other activities. It's central, of course, to their physical and mental health. At least that's what Pierce and Gilman will say. So the question is, of course, how does this look architecturally? You, of course, have much more radical and much less radical versions of cooperative housekeeping. I would say the conservative version is basically where houses aren't linked, but a central property is rented and people take turns or pool out their resources to hire help to cook for them. Meals then could be taken in this lovely dining room or could be taken home, along the line of sort of a delivery company. So you have those two options. And here is in sort of images of workers at a certain cooperative kitchen shown in Ladies' Home Journal. And I want you to note, of course, these people have actual uniforms on. And they could, again, you could sit here, have a nice dinner or lunch, or you could have things actually delivered to your home. But of course, you have the much more radical variants as well. And that's where things, I think, get interesting. So you have a patent, sort of, from this particular gentleman, dating to 1890, where you essentially have a central kitchen that is linked via covered walkway to a number of individual homes or row houses, each of which have a separate little dining room. So you still have sort of the primacy of your original or sort of home dining room, but at the same time, there you go, everyone has their own little dining room. It's much more sort of easily accessible. And I'll show you other couple images of this kind of thing. Cooperative kitchen, covered passageway. They seem a little bit sort of overwrought. And then you get to the really crazy, zany examples, such as this one, which has a monorail and, seems pretty awesome. Okay. And again, these are published in Ladies' Home Journal. So this is really something that's sort of taking off in, I think, the popular press at the time. And of course, I wanted to ask you guys, is this something that's still pressing today? This idea of sort of how much time and labor goes into prepping food in particular, but I even think about cleaning. And, we in some ways have this sort of modern equivalent of 19th century dinner delivery companies, not necessarily cooperative kitchens, but you have things like Plated.com or HelloFresh or Blue Apron, even Fresh Direct. You can go to Whole Foods or even your local supermarket and get pre-prepared food that you can then take home and either heat up or it's already actually hot. This saves you, again, for a certain amount of money, maybe some of your time and your energy. So I would say it's still a little bit of an issue. And I have two very small children, so I always find like that period between 4:30, 5 o'clock and 6 is like crazy, crazy, crazy. And I'm sort of thinking like, maybe I should order one of those special things that like delivers food to your house. I don't know. But it's really popular at the turn of the century, even into the 1920s. And special boxes that nicely fit into sort of wagons are invented, and you have ideas of insulated containers, again, that will deliver your food to you sort of nice and hot. But I would say, on the whole, you don't really have communal or cooperative kitchens taking off in the way that Pierce or Gilman had hoped at the turn of the century. What you do have, I think, by the 1970s and 1980s in particular, is this idea that sort of certain demographics can be served by creating more community-based spaces and having these kind of shared dining spaces. And where you see it, I think, and where I actually first encountered it was in sort of housing for the elderly. So my mother, or not my mother, I should say, my grandmother lived in an assisted living facility where she had her own little apartment, but she almost never used the kitchen. She went downstairs and ate with everyone else. She didn't have to engage in housekeeping. And of course, she paid a premium for this type of thing. So you'll start to see these kinds of designs really becoming popular in the 1970s and 1980s, on into the 1990s. And of course, that brings us a little bit to a more, I would say, less specific demographic, and to Vermont, where you have things like co-housing developing. And they're actually coming from sort of German and Scandinavian precedents with this idea, essentially, that you have, in this case, in Bristol, 14 separate households who are going to live in close proximity to one another and share a common house. They may not take all of their meals there. All of these apartments, villas, townhomes, you name it, they range from about 800 to about 1,500 square feet in size. Everyone has their own little home, but should they want to gather for community spaces, should they want to cook together or arrange to sort of trade off on cooking duties, you have a renovated 1863 Italianate villa that sort of serves these purposes. And it's actually opening, I believe, this spring. And it's done by Vermont Integrated Architecture, who actually are in Middlebury, which I think is sort of interesting. So different kinds of models, I think, in some ways, pretty far formally from this, but I think a little bit of the impulse is actually the same. So when I mentioned things are sort of old and new again, I feel like these are issues we continue to grapple with moving forward. And of course, you also see it, I think, to a smaller degree, and maybe not so socially pressing, in sort of townhome condo developments, where you have some communal social spaces, but you don't have this premium being placed on the kind of togetherness that you get with housing for the elderly, or something much more intentional like this co-housing development in Bristol. But I wanted to turn to another thing at the end of this particular lecture. So I was going to think about sort of old is new again, and of course we have a whole new set of problems, but I would again argue that none of these are entirely and completely new. And I wanted to bring up the idea of the Mcmansion, which I think has seen its day to some extent. So the Mcmansion is a term that was actually, I would say, popularized or coined or codified by the architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable in her 2008 book on architecture, though I think it was existing sort of before she used it in this particular book. It, of course, is a pejorative term for a large new home, which is judged as pretentious, tasteless, or badly designed for its neighborhood. So think again of all of Kathryn Beecher's criticisms. The term is generally used to denote a multi-story home with no clear architectural style, so certainly not your sort of Gothic revival cottage that you get with Beecher, with a larger footprint than existing homes in the area, or located in a newer, larger subdivision, but a place where basically the lot doesn't quite fit the house. So oftentimes sort of clear-cut farmland, little tiny lot, giant house, of indistinguishable kind of style. And when you think about energy consumption spaces that maybe are not the best planned. And I think you can think, of course, about what Beecher would say about this, but I would say you have another voice from the turn of the century that I think we can throw in the mix and channel when you think about the Mcmansion, and that would be Edith Wharton. And most of you probably know, yes, that Edith Wharton who wrote The House of Mirth and The Age of Innocence. She also wrote something in 1897 with her friend Ogden Cogman Jr. called The Decoration of Houses, that basically took things like the Newport mansions, such as the Breakers, to task and levels at them the same kinds of criticism people today would level at the Mcmansion. That people are a little bit too big for their britches, that there seems to be a style, but it varies from room to room to room, that even if you are a Vanderbilt, maybe you shouldn't be living in a house that looks a lot like a palace associated with the Palace of Versailles, the Petit Trianon, that maybe you don't really need a room that looks like the Hall of Mirrors when you are just a very, very well-heeled American. So that sort of, I think, brings it around. So whatever we think of Mcmansions, Edith Wharton had sort of seen it and done it beforehand. And this, I think, of course, leads us to sort of the final point I want to make, and maybe just leave it open to you guys. Something I think in some ways is a reaction to the Mcmansion, but also comes out of course, this long line of attempts at simplification. Think Beecher, and again, the bungalow may be updated, and that would be the tiny house phenomenon. And I just threw this sort of, I did a quick search and was like, okay, tiny houses, and here you have a company that's selling certain tiny houses, and there's the footprint of one. And I think the question I would always like to ask is, why is this appealing? Is this something that fits into this larger continuum? To whom does it appeal? And what maybe are the limitations of this model? Simply sort of making things smaller scale, does that actually get at some of the social issues that a lot of these earlier reformers were trying to deal with? Is it just sort of an updated version of the arts and crafts interior and this sort of attempt at simplification? I'm not quite sure. So that is my open-ended question. And thank you for your time and your attention. So I was told try it for 45 minutes, and I think I did it.
But now we have questions.
Exactly. It's always my favorite part.
Yeah. Okay. And first, I'd like to start with a question because I forgot to ask. The Humanities Council asked me to ask how many people are here tonight that are not Brattleboro residents. So can you just show me your hands? Okay. All right, good. That's done. All right, that's my question answered. Okay, who else has a question? Oh, yeah.
Right there.
Where does the farmhouse fit into this? That was mentioned in the publicity for this, but and you didn't touch on that. But
Yeah.
how does that fit into the Victorian picture versus, the craftsman?
It's hard because I think you have to think about region. You know, when you're talking about the farmhouses at the New England farmhouses, the Midwestern farmhouses, at your farmhouse out west. I think in some ways that escapes a lot of the criticisms because it's much more of a working space than your sort of, and it's not to say that a farmhouse wouldn't have a parlor, but it doesn't have that same kind of function that you would get, I think, in your more sort of typical Victorian. It's not so consumerist. In some ways they sort of escape because they're producing, they're not consuming. And I think that's one of the things that I would say Katherine Beecher in particular is really sort of up in arms about, is this idea of you're just consuming, you're consuming, you're doing everything for show. And if you deal with a working space like a farmhouse, that all of a sudden, like, you're not even in the same realm. So that would be my...
But the kitchens were still mainly in the back.
Yes, and I would say they're almost always in the back because there's this idea of, again, the public space, even if this is not a place that's that frequented, but sort of dirty spaces of the home, the working spaces almost need to be sort of, but if you think about the farmhouse,
similar.
yes, being surrounded by dirty working space. So it's not quite the same, but I think that's a great question. Yeah, you have food access to, in a home that you sort of, again, move from dining room is going to be the front, kitchen, working space, even scullery is like the subdivision of spaces.
Chip, our architect.
Ah, great.
So I have a partly an architectural question.
Yeah.
About 6 months ago, I was asked to design a tiny house, sort of a house, and it's been a trip ever since. I'm wondering, I guess I'm turning your question to us around to you. Looking at the movement towards tiny houses in the perspective of architectural history, do you see it as likely a fad that will go away, or as fitting into a style acknowledging changing economics and changing morality that will hold a place in history?
I think it definitely fits into this larger continuum, but I have a sense, to me, it always feels a little faddish, in that what's the difference really between something like this and maybe a slightly larger mobile home? You know, and you think about the people it's serving. So all, you know, the subtext for a lot of this is almost all sort of middle class domestic reform. And I feel like this ends up really being pitched at the same demographic, this sort of need or feeling like I need to simplify, and thinking about even, you know, the accessibility of these, like how do you get financing? You know, it's more like a boat than it is like a home loan. Do you have to get the land? Can you put this anywhere you want? There are lots of things that I think make this, you know, I feel like the impulse, I understand that, but it doesn't, it feels a little faddish to me, but that's just me. Yeah.
From what I've studied about, both about communal properties and tiny houses, so I think there's an economic element to it, and I think one reason why the community houses didn't take off in the early part of last century is because companies like General Electric realized it was better to sell 15 ovens rather than one to 15 families. And that had, you know, General Electric had amazing influence on.
I would totally agree with you. Where you start to see that things lighten up is the 1920s, where you're exactly coming out of the First World War, get this miniaturization of household technologies. Where, you know, before in, you know, 1900, it makes a lot of sense to band together and buy something that would be prohibitively expensive, you know, that saves sort of labor. Where, yeah, you know, 20, 30 years later, this becomes much more accessible. And I think, you know, the advertising campaigns that go into all of these too. I mean, one of the classes I sometimes teach is on tailorization and exactly like GE and all of these companies, the way they sell, you know, their appliances and the way they're even sort of marketed part and parcel. When you look in the 1950s at Levittown and a lot of these designs, they're actually, they come with the house. That's one of the perks of having this house, is all these consumer goods. So you can think of that as almost like, I thought about including that and I was like, okay, because that's a good, like, what would Katherine Beecher think too? It's the same sort of thing. No, you're absolutely right.
As far as tiny houses,
yeah.
I think it's also, there's a cultural element too. I think a lot of young people are realizing that, I mean, they can't buy a house.
Yeah.
Wages have been increased. So they're, well, I can afford to build this small thing. And also, there's a growing scarcity of resources, so people are trying to live with less. And I don't know, maybe we'll find another planet and we can do away with that scarcity or something, but I think if we're going to live here, it's probably going to be...
Yeah, not to be so wasteful.
Less of that.
Yeah.
But,
no, I think you're right when you're thinking about particularly the young people who are drawn to this. And I think about the climate too. Like, it makes more sense if you have a tiny house in Florida and you spend a lot of your time outside, or you live in a climate where it doesn't rain all the time, but all of a sudden you add that snow. And if you have small children, I always think, like, I would go bananas. You want a pet? You know, I oftentimes, and I think one of the things when I was thinking about the Mcmansions and the tiny house phenomenon, they're both sort of feature really heavily in like HGTV and all of those shows, like living the tiny house dream versus flipping your house. They've sort of both been sort of marketed, which is where it makes me think, like, I get the impetus and I get the impulse, and I feel like good things will come out of this, but is this precisely it? I'm not sure. Is this where we're going to end up? Is this the solution? I don't know.
It seems to me that, you know, this this tiny house, it'd be great, you could get one in your 20s and get an additional one in your 30s and an additional one.
And then they're modular tiny
You get
houses.
60
Yeah.
and you give one of them away.
Well, and there's
Get rid of your
something, and I think there's something about the do-it-yourself sort of aspect that often goes with this that's really, really appealing that you see with craftsman homes as well. Yeah, it's to me, it's interesting.
About the food,
Yeah, sure.
my daughter and 2 other families, one of them cooks for the 3 families 1 night a week, and so each person gets 2 nights off cooking. And that's the whole thing. It's nice
Exactly.
deal.
Yeah, and actually, before people came up with these ideas of delivery companies or these more formal cooperative kitchens, you have precisely this. But then you still have the idea of like, are people, it's a barter system. So there's part of the debate is like, should you pay people wages for this kind of work, or does the barter system work just as well? Yeah, no, but that takes a lot of planning.
You had brought before about what's the difference between a tiny house and an RV. A lot of it actually is, honestly, sometimes not a lot. But the reason that these are built on trailers doesn't have anything to do with portability. It has everything to do with zoning.
Exactly.
And because, great, I would like to build a very small house on my property on a slab, but I can't do that because I'm forced to build within a certain square footage.
Exactly.
And so this is a kind of a loophole to get around that.
Well, and you even think about zoning in certain cities where you can't have like a grandmother suite. You can't have, 2 families sharing the same space. There are tricky things that I think like sometimes our laws haven't quite caught up to this. And I feel like that's one of the pitfalls sort of the tiny house phenomenon too.
And I'm looking forward to, there's been a lot of code changes recently to building practices so that we can have smaller dwellings. But it's largely going to be dependent on every locale being able to adopt that and perhaps even changing their own standards.
Yeah, and I always think about not so much of tiny houses, but also just unconventional architecture and co-housing and all these things is, again, on the point of accessibility, is if things are out of the norm, it's again harder to get a loan, it's harder to sell. I mean, I think of when I was buying a home up in Middlebury and I'm on the tenure track, I'd think I'm not gonna build some crazy zany way out their house because I may have to sell in a couple of years, heaven forbid if I don't get tenure. We may have to pick up and leave. And so you have to think about where can I get, you have to, sometimes you have to play it safe.
A lot of places, a lot of banks will do it as a personal loan. If you stop thinking of it as an investment.
Exactly.
That you can turn around and sell, but like a traditional home,
Exactly.
you can turn around and use the income that you have because you're spending less and invest that in yourself or in other popular investments.
Yeah, I agree. Other questions?
It's not so much a question as a comment. When I go back to my hometown of Manchester, Connecticut, which is a suburb, so to speak, and it was then, and I look at the housing that was typical of my growing up in the 50s and 60s, it's small. It's what we would today call a cottage community, and I look at these and I think, wow, we grew up in these, and while the tiny house is a different kind of square footage, many of those houses were only 800 to 1,000 square feet, and there is a movement toward that when you think of simplicity also, and that was all post-World War II. That was the Levittowns and...
Exactly. And even slightly more upscale version of Levittown. I think of the house that we bought, it's from 1947, it's a cape. And it basically is the house that my grandparents owned after the war and that my dad spent the first 10 years of his life in.
But those capes were much smaller
it's tiny. Yeah, it's
than
not
the
a big
capes
house.
that they're building today.
Exactly. This is not a big house by any stretch of it. Especially I'm from the Midwest. You're like, what is this? This little teeny tiny house.
I think there's another issue, which is I've lived in big houses. My parents had this huge Victorian thing, 25 rooms, and we only used about 5 because they couldn't deal with dealing with it. And then I lived in a commune, and there were great things about it, and then we were all over each other, and some people were piggy, and some people weren't, and that wasn't perfect. Nobody was perfect there. And I've lived alone, and I rented an apartment in New York, and it had a front near the road and a middle room and a kitchen where I slept and painted and did everything. And I found in reality, I liked being in the one room. And I have a partner. I like being with him, even though we don't have similar tastes. But I think some of us, some people, I don't need all this room. And there's something very comforting about little cottages. I always liked camp. I liked being in a tent with all my buddies. So, you know, I really think it comes down to we're all individuals and what works for us, and nothing's all going to work.
No.
And sometimes I like eating with other people, and I like eating together too. So I think a lot of it is we need to talk to each other and be with each other. We need privacy and stuff like that. But I think that possibly the small houses, let's just be close to each other. Thank you.
Any last questions?
I'll dive into the question,
Oh, all right.
which ties into the tiny house. When we're dealing with issues of addressing homelessness, there's certainly opportunities there where you're dealing with tiny houses or creating specific tiny houses. It may not be a permanent resident for one person, but it is their home. And you can fit a lot of them on a small bit of real estate. So what would be the benefit of that versus the benefit of a building that follows an apartment? So if you're trying to house the homeless, which is a better model?
There's something, I think, going back to the 19th century even, about the single-family home, whatever size it is, that reads as sort of individualistic. It reads as sort of this proper, again, setting for family, or even a single person, where I think if you have a larger complex, even if beautifully planned, it can feel in some ways institutional. Where that little bit of green space, your own front door, versus having to share a sort of a doorway or a hallway with other people, there's something about that, I think, that's really sort of compelling and might be more appealing to people, I think, living on the margins.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's sort of the shame element of winding up in a project, if you will.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Might be a question that's better for another lecture, since I know this is about single-family living. But I'm curious what your take is on sort of the intergenerational aspect of life right now, considering that many of us may be taking care of older parents soon, but we also have children who are about to finish college, and with the economy and what that means for housing, which some of them are building tiny houses, but and sort of how that plays into what kind of architecture people are considering right now.
Yeah, I feel like I don't know if I can answer entirely, but my opinion is you just need more flexibility. And I think thinking about zoning and all these codes, and I think about even the little sort of cape that we live in, that my parents come to visit, and they come sort of a far distance, and then we're all on top of each other. And it's great to be like, have family togetherness with my 2 kids and our dogs and our cat and, you know, my husband. But then you add my parents in the mix, and like, that's good with me, but not so much maybe with my husband all the time, being on top of each other and having them sleep in the children's playroom. So I think there definitely need to be sort of more creative solutions, and maybe isn't adding square footage per se, maybe it's rearranging the space. I mean, we always talk about like even the idea of sort of finishing your basement, but I feel like, you know, I think my husband's always saying like, oh, when the kids go off to, you know, college, we can maybe go to somewhere smaller. But I'm like, but they'll be back, and they'll bring friends, and then they'll probably bring like significant others, and maybe my parents will be with us by that point. And so then do you actually need a little bit more space? But can you devise that space in sort of a smart way that isn't wasteful?
And that doesn't seem like it was as much of an element in history, at least in what you touched on.
It depends on sort of social class as well. And part of what I think, even thinking about these women who are advocating for these cooperative kitchens, these are middle class women and upper middle class women. These are not working class people who are living in sort of extended family situations. So they have, even if they don't have the means, they have a lot of help. And I even think about, you know, in my local community, you know, people who maybe are struggling more financially, but they have other resources that aren't necessarily things they're paying for, you know, where my parents live far away. So if I need coverage to go to a lecture at, you know, 5:30 and my husband can't go, like, who do I call? I have to hire out the help. I mean, I have to call a babysitter, which isn't a terrible thing, but that's something that I think is, yeah, sort of a pressing concern, at least for working parents.
Is that how something like this could come in handy. You know, you have
What
some room on your lawn.
Yes, I mean, you could, I mean, and I have read about people doing this, if they have space and if they're in a place where this is allowed, that you park a little tiny house and it's basically like a second home, or on a plot of land as a vacation home where you're spending most of your time outside. I feel like that's a good market for this. And again, young people. But you think, does this work in this current configuration for a family of like 6 with a dog? Probably not. Yeah, for the extras, exactly, for overflow. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Though I'm thinking like, my dad in a tiny house, yeah, no. He needs space to like walk and pace. And any other questions?
I think there's something that can be said for not making your guests or relatives too comfortable.
Yes, and fish and guests.
So the function of something like that, and you had some sort of location outside of town where you had 4 or 5 of these, and you call them and they would deliver it for the weekend.
Oh, it's like the cars, where you can rent the car, The zip car, the zip house. Perfect. That would be awesome.
That's a great idea for everyone. Well, thank you so much, Erin. And also I want to let people know that on the book display rack back there, we have pulled a bunch of books on tiny houses. So if you're interested in building your own or starting a business where you might rent them, there we do have some resources back there. And thank you so much for coming, and I'll see you at the library.
Thank you for your questions.